Good morning, Wache, Charlie Angus, Nidijina Cass. I'm proud to be here this morning on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Canadians were rightly appalled when they learned that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, skipped out on the very first ever Day of National Reconciliation and Truth in order to go to the beach. This was not a day set out to be a holiday. This is a day of atonement for Canadians to come to terms with the need to address the policies that have gone on throughout our history that focused on the destruction of Indigenous families. I'm very pleased to learn the Prime Minister has apologized for this lapse of judgment. But it does raise the question of how serious this government is about the issues of reconciliation. Canada faces a historic reckoning, and this Prime Minister and this Parliament, all of us as Canadians, we do not have the option of checking out at this time in our history. Because we're not talking about past wrongs. We're talking about the unbroken line of government policies that have targeted Indigenous families right up to this day. From the finding of the 215 graves in Kamloops in late May, to last Wednesday's federal court ruling that struck down all the Liberal arguments in denying compensation to First Nation children in the broken child welfare system, we are reminded again and again that reconciliation is the fundamental question facing Canadians today, and it must be addressed in this new Parliament. So I am offering 4 steps for the Prime Minister to take in order to set this government and this Parliament on a path of true reconciliation with the Indigenous communities of our nation. Step number 1. The Prime Minister must end his multi-year, multi-million-dollar legal battle against Cindy Blackstock, the Human Rights Tribunal, and Indigenous children. Step number 2. The government must address the massive miscarriage of justice committed against the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School. Step number 3. In order to show that the government is serious about a new direction, the Prime Minister needs to ensure that Carolyn Bennett is no longer in the cabinet, because it was under her watch that the government spent millions in the cover-up of the St. Anne's legal abuses. And step number 4, this government needs to put in a credible plan for holding the Catholic Church accountable for the money that it owes to survivors, and to ensure that the Church and its multiple orders and dioceses comply with the obligations to turn over the documents that relate to the deaths in the residential schools and the names of the known perpetrators. So let's go through these steps in just greater detail. Last Wednesday's federal court ruling was definitive. It has trashed every single Liberal argument that has been used to obstruct, delay, and attempt to overturn the Human Rights Tribunal ruling of 2016. That ruling found this government guilty of, quote, willful and reckless discrimination against First Nation children. Rather than negotiate a solution when that ruling came down, the government has opted to spend millions on lawyers, and they've piled up a long list of dismal legal defeats, including the 9 non-compliance orders that ultimately led to the Human Rights Tribunal deciding to put a monetary compensation award in place because of the refusal of Mr. Trudeau to negotiate. So what did we find in the court ruling? Well, the federal court found that, contrary to claims by the Attorney General and Minister Mark Miller, that the government is not the victim of injustice here. It is Indigenous children. That the issues of compensation ordered by the tribunal are justified because of the systemic and reckless discrimination that was practiced by government policy and the absolute refusal of the government to negotiate solutions. And what makes this even more damaging in the eyes of the federal court is that they note that the government was fully aware of the damage that was being caused by the mass removal of children from their communities, and yet the government refused to address this. So now that he's back from the beach, one of the first decisions the Prime Minister will have to make is whether or not he will accept this ruling and finally negotiate a solution, or will he waste millions of dollars more in this losing attempt to deny justice to vulnerable children. On the St. Anne's Residential School file, we learned during the election from the interim report by Justice Pitfield that the St. Anne's survivors were victims of a massive miscarriage of justice at the hands of the Justice Department of Canada. We know that at least 81 survivors of horrific sex, child abuse, and rape had their claims falsely adjudicated because of the decision by the Justice Department to suppress evidence in hearings and protect the names of the perpetrators. And in the last 6 years, this government has spent millions, literally $15,000 a week, to cover up this legal abuse and to block these survivors from justice. In light of Pitfield's report, the government must put a serious offer on the table with the survivors of St. Anne's and admit that they perpetuated a deliberate legal injustice by suppressing the police evidence of the known crimes committed at St. Anne's. And of course, then this leads me to why I think Carolyn Bennett should not be in cabinet. Well, if the government is serious about establishing a credible relationship, she cannot be appointed to a position because it's under her watch that the government made the decision to spend the millions to deny the rights of St. Anne's survivors from getting those hearings reopened. There needs to be accountability in this country for what happened. And that accountability involves those in the Justice Department, the independent assessment process, and fundamentally the minister who oversaw this legal travesty. On accountability from the Catholic Church, well, we learn more and more and more about how they've exploited loopholes, how they refuse to come to the table on true reconciliation, how their offer of so-called in-kind services to escape from the accountability for committing crimes against children, that included the money they were using for proselytizing. That does not meet the test of reconciliation. The government must put in a credible plan to hold the Catholic Church to account and to ensure that the institution and its various orders lives up to the legal and moral obligations to turn over all the documents of the operations of the residential schools, along with all their case files of known perpetrators of abuse. Now, the government continues to refuse to reach out to the Office of the Criminal Prosecutions to establish a special prosecutor, and the Prime Minister and the Attorney General's offer of a so-called interlocutor to advise the government is fundamentally lame because it will not hold the Church to account. So today I invite the Prime Minister, with the setting of a new Parliament and the establishment of his cabinet, to get serious about the issues of reconciliation, to work with Indigenous leadership across this country, and the NDP is willing to work with the government to guarantee a better future for this young generation of Indigenous children. Les Canadiens ont été choqués que le Premier ministre soit allé à la plage au lieu de participer à la Journée nationale de vérité et de réconciliation. Ce n'était pas un jour férié, c'était un jour pour le Canada d'accepter la responsabilité des crimes commis contre les peuples autochtones. La question de réconciliation est la question fondamentale à laquelle le Canada est confronté aujourd'hui. Ce nouveau Parlement doit répondre à ces questions. Donc, ce matin, je présente 4 étapes d'aider le Premier ministre pour établir un processus crédible d'assurer la vraie réconciliation avec les communautés autochtones. D'abord, M. Trudeau doit mettre fin à sa bataille juridique contre les droits des enfants autochtones. Il doit accepter la décision du tribunal fédéral concernant la nécessité de payer des indemnités aux enfants. Deuxièmement, le gouvernement doit négocier une solution juste avec les survivants des pensionnats de Sainte-Anne. Troisièmement, Carolyn Bennett ne doit pas être nommée au cabinet. Pourquoi? Elle a dépensé des millions de dollars pour lutter contre les survivants de Sainte-Anne et elle a protégé la dissimulation du gouvernement. Ce n'est pas acceptable. En quatrième, le gouvernement doit tenir l'Église catholique responsable pour payer leur argent aux survivants et d'exiger tous les documents sur les crimes commis aux pensionnats autochtones. J'invite le Premier ministre à travailler avec les communautés autochtones partout au Canada et aussi le NPD pour faire de la réconciliation une réalité au Canada et garantir un avenir meilleur pour cette génération des enfants autochtones. I'll take any questions.
And we'll now take questions, starting with questions on the phone. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions, commençant par les questions au téléphone. Un petit rappel, une question suivie par journaliste. Opératrice, avons-nous une première question?
Merci. Alors, appuyez sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. Please press star 1 if you have a question. And we have no questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons aucune question pour le moment.
And we'll now take questions in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions dans la salle.
Good morning. Tanya McCharles at the Toronto Star. Mr. Angus, I have a question about, you said the government needs to have a plan to hold the Catholic Church accountable. But maybe it's obvious, but you haven't spoken to what documents and materials and records the government has in control itself. It has copies of a lot of that. If you could speak to that. Yeah. And I guess the other thing I'm interested in knowing is, a lot of this is all around reconciliation. And on the campaign trail, we heard a little bit about the flags at half-mast. And as Parliament comes back, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about when and how the flags should be raised to full mast.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. Certainly, in terms of the documents that when we discuss, the Catholic Church and the other Christian orders worked hand in hand with the federal government. And we know that many of the names of the perpetrators are in the hands of the Justice Department already. Certainly, we know of the multiple perpetrators of abuse at St. Anne's. All that evidence is in the hands of the Justice Department. So the government has that evidence. They have the tools to establish a special prosecution by reaching out to the Director of Criminal Prosecutions to talk about the need to actually have a coherent strategy. But in terms of the Catholic Church, we do know that the orders were dismal at complying with their obligations to turn over records. We have heard, and I'm very, very pleased to hear that the Catholic Church has apologized in Canada and are offering to put money on the table, but we know that the in-kind donations that were offered is ridiculous. We don't believe that there's trust right now between the Canadian people and the Church on this file. So the government has an obligation to deal with the documents, and I think they should be in the hands of a special prosecutor, that what the government has. But we do need all the church orders to be compelled to turn over the documents so we can get a clear picture of the crimes that were committed. In terms of the flags at half-mast, that's a question I believe that really belongs to the Indigenous people of this country to make that call. That's not something that I have any ability, I think, to weigh in on.
And just on a follow-up, your call for a special prosecutor, in Canada, we have a system whereby prosecutors and their decisions are independent. So why would you assume that having the federal government or an executive branch decide who and shouldn't be investigated and prosecuted is a good idea?
Well, what we're talking about in Canada are crimes committed by the state against an entire people. We're talking about crimes that meet the test of international crimes against humanity. When you're looking at mass graves at multiple residential schools, it does not pass the credibility test for the Prime Minister to say, well, these are local issues. They are not. These were part of a state-run policy of the destruction of Indigenous people. So we are in uncharted waters here. We do not have, as in the United States, the grand jury system, which was used very effectively in holding, for example, the Boston Diocese to account. So what we do have is we have the Office of Criminal Prosecutions, and it is within the power of the Attorney General to reach out to them and say, given the fact that these are crimes that were committed nationally, we believe this should be investigated. It's up to then the criminal prosecutions to establish a special prosecutor. But for David Lametti to throw his hands up in the air and say, oh my God, this is so terrible, we don't know what we're going to do, to me is just more of the excuses that the government has used down through the years when we're trying, well, they try to avoid these issues of crimes against the people.
Rafi?
Good morning, Rafi Buchanan, CBC News. You're asking Carolyn Bennett not to be reappointed to cabinet, at least not to the portfolio she previously had. What good would that do, considering that this is the same government that's returning to power at the end of the day? Meaning, was the decision even in her hands?
Well, that's a very good question. I think when we look at what happened to the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School, some of the worst crimes one could ever imagine being committed against children were part of the daily life of children in this institution. And when the survivors came forward under the independent assessment process, the Government of Canada had an obligation to present the documents. The government had 10,000 pages of evidence. They had the names of all the perpetrators. They had all the witnesses. And they went into hearings and lied. They lied and said there was no evidence of crimes against at St. Anne's. So either we have a justice system in Canada that protects everyone, or we have a justice system that protects the settlers and says to survivors of horrific rape and abuse, sorry, we decided to suppress evidence and hide the names of the perpetrators. So when that became known publicly, the only reasonable step was to find a solution. And instead, under the watch of Carolyn Bennett, the government spent millions. They blocked access to the survivors at every step of the way. And now we know from Justice Pitfield's interim report, which is not even a report that's fully looked into it, that at least 81 cases were falsely adjudicated. That is a massive miscarriage of justice. So responsibility has to lie somewhere. And if it doesn't lie in the hands of the minister who oversaw it, then there is no justice. I think Carolyn Bennett, and I've known her for many years, and I've liked Carolyn Bennett, and I've talked with her many times, but she does not belong in cabinet at this time in our history when we see the massive injustice that was done against St. Anne's and the massive injustice that continues because her office still refuses to sit down with the survivors to negotiate a just solution.
Mackenzie?
Hi, Mr. Angus. Mackenzie Gray with CTV. You've spoken about how you don't want Ms. Bennett back in cabinet. I'd just like your opinion on Minister Miller. Would you be comfortable with him returning to his role?
Well, you know, I've worked with Minister Miller, I've worked with Minister Bennett, I've worked with Minister Lametti. You know, I like them all as people. There has to be accountability here. I think if Minister Miller is going to return to his post, he needs to say that the arguments that he used in the legal battles against the Indigenous children doesn't cut it because the federal court's blown that out of the water. So I'm reaching out to Minister Miller to say, okay, you guys lost the federal court case. You've spent $10 million on this fight. Do the right thing and we'll work with you.
Just want to change gears quickly to what happened with the election. You're one of the senior figures in the NDP. I know you were hoping for a better night than what you got. Two questions. One, can you just diagnose kind of what went wrong and why your party didn't win more seats? And two, are you comfortable with Jagmeet Singh being the leader of the NDP going to the next election?
Those are excellent questions, and tomorrow you're going to have a whole bunch of NDP members to ask questions from, and some may have different points of view, and I'm more than willing to answer all those questions tomorrow when our caucus is here, but I'm going to focus on reconciliation today.